The world did not expect this. In Ouagadougou, the dusty capital of Burkina Faso, a single announcement shattered Washington's calm and echoed across an entire continent. All CIA personnel must leave within 48 hours. Those were not the words of a diplomat or a bureaucrat, they were the command of a young soldier, Captain Ibrahim Traoré. For years, the United States called its presence in Burkina Faso a security partnership. They said they were there to fight terrorism, to stabilize the Sahel, to protect. But when Traoré spoke, he peeled back that curtain and revealed something very different, a network of surveillance hidden beneath the language of cooperation. What the West described as protection, he exposed as control. Imagine it, a landlocked African nation among the poorest in the world, staring down the world's most powerful intelligence agency and saying enough. No warnings, no negotiations. Just a ticking clock, 48 hours for the CIA to pack up and disappear. And for millions watching across Africa, this was more than news. It was history in motion. The kind of defiance the world hasn't seen since Thomas Sankara or Patrice Lumumba. A young leader daring to say what others only whispered, "We will not be watched while we sleep." But what happens next? Can a small nation survive the wrath of a superpower and still stand on its own feet? Or will the same invisible forces that have shaped Africa for decades strike back again? Please share if you believe that truth is stronger than fear. Subscribe if you believe that Africa's freedom and the courage of President Ibrahim Traoré deserves to be remembered. It began not with rumors, not with whispers in diplomatic corridors, but with a voice, a soldier's voice, calm, steady, and final. On a gray morning in Ouagadougou, Captain Ibrahim Traoré looked into the camera and said the words that would ricochet from the Sahel to Washington. All U.S. intelligence personnel, including CIA operatives, have 48 hours to leave Burkina Faso. There was no preamble, no soft phrasing, no joint restructuring, just a clock ticking loudly across oceans. For decades, African nations had learned to live with the presence of foreign advisors and security experts. Their bases were scattered from Niger to Chad, their uniforms and flags blending into the landscape under the banner of counter-terrorism. But Traoré saw something different. He saw antennas on rooftops that weren't supposed to be there. He saw encrypted signals spiking every time his defense council met. He saw rooms inside the joint facility that no Burkina soldier was ever allowed to enter. At first, his generals thought it was just routine foreign oversight. But when technicians traced the transmissions, their source led back not to Bamako, not to Abuja, but to servers connected to foreign intelligence networks. The so-called Security Cooperation Facility was not what it claimed to be. It was, in Traoré's words, a nest of eyes watching our soil, not protecting it. Within hours, he summoned his national security team. No one expected what came next. Instead of quietly requesting an internal review, as so many African leaders have done before Traoré went public, he named names. He issued coordinates. Then came the official document hand-delivered to the U.S. Embassy granting all CIA operatives a strict 48-hour window to leave. It was not just a bureaucratic order. It was a declaration of identity. A message to both his people and the world: Burkina Faso will no longer trade sovereignty for security. In the capital, military, police surrounded the compound suspected of housing the CIA's operations. Reports say Burkina officers were stationed outside, ensuring that no unapproved data transfers or equipment removals took place. Inside, servers hummed, cables were sealed, and crates were packed under watchful eyes. The tension in Ouagadougou was thick enough to taste a quiet standoff between a small nation reclaiming its pride and a superpower caught off guard. Washington's initial reaction was disbelief. The State Department issued a statement insisting that all U.S. activities in Burkina Faso are transparent and dedicated to counter-terrorism. But in the Sahel, those words had become a broken record, a line repeated each time a foreign footprint deepened. For Traoré, this was not about ideology or anger, it was about survival. Over the past year, his administration had survived multiple assassination attempts, many traced back to intelligence leaks. Each time sensitive information was shared in a joint meeting, militants somehow learned of troop movements. To Traoré, the connection was no longer coincidence, it was betrayal. That betrayal hardened him. It changed his definition of friendship and partnership. So when the evidence piled up, he did not call for negotiation, he called for sovereignty. And in that moment, the young captain turned statesman stood where few African leaders ever dared, on the edge between fear and freedom. He knew the price, he knew the risk, but he also knew the symbolism. Because this act, this 48-hour ultimatum, was not merely about the CIA. It was about centuries of oversight disguised as aid of surveillance, sold as safety of submission, masked as partnership. As the sun set that evening, people in Ouagadougou gathered around radios and phones listening to the replay of his speech. Some cheered, some cried, but everyone understood what it meant. A line had been drawn in the dust, and this time it would not be erased. The world held its breath. 48 hours. That was all the time the most powerful intelligence agency on Earth had to disappear from one of the smallest, poorest nations on the planet. In Washington, disbelief turned to alarm. Behind closed doors, State Department officials scrambled for answers. Satellite images of Ouagadougou were reviewed in real time. Encrypted cables flew between Langley and the Pentagon. How could this have happened? How could a 36-year-old African soldier challenge the very nerve center of Western intelligence? Publicly, the response was calm, almost patronizing. "We are reviewing the situation," a White House spokesperson said. But within intelligence circles, the shock was absolute. The United States had been expelled not by an adversary like Russia or China, but by a supposed ally. Yet in Africa, something very different was happening. Across social media, across coffee shops and university halls, across villages from Dakar to Dar es Salaam, the name Traore became a rallying cry. A generation raised on surveillance and foreign control saw in him a reflection of defiance they had only read about in history books. The footage of him standing firm in his simple uniform, speaking not from a teleprompter but from conviction, went viral overnight. He was called the son of Sankara reborn. Some compared him to Nkrumah, others to Lumumba. But all agreed this was not just a decision, it was a declaration of African dignity. Still inside Burkina Faso, the atmosphere was tense. Western journalists rushed to the capital desperate for access to the expelled base. They were met with silence and heavily guarded checkpoints. Local officers confirmed that U.S. personnel were packing equipment under supervision, while the government's cyber unit monitored outgoing transmissions. Every move, every byte of data was now under scrutiny. The symbolism was immense. For decades, Western governments had assumed that African nations dependent on aid, on loans, on cooperation would never dare to expose the hand that feeds them. But Traore had just broken that unspoken rule. In his televised address, he did not speak like a rebel or a populist. His tone was calm, surgical. "We will not allow our sovereignty to be negotiated," he said. "Protection that comes with chains is not protection. It is captivity." That line became immortal overnight. It was quoted in newspapers across the continent, painted on murals, and echoed in Friday prayers. In Washington, analysts warned that Traore's defiance could ignite a domino effect. If Niger, already skeptical of U.S. operations at Airbase 201, followed suit, the entire Sahel strategy of the United States could collapse overnight. The alarm was real because this was no longer about one leader. It was about a continent slowly waking up from decades of quiet supervision. Meanwhile, Western media struggled to contain the narrative. Some outlets painted Traore as an impulsive nationalist. Others went further, hinting that Russian influence was behind the move. But Africans saw through it. They knew propaganda when they heard it. Because for the first time in a generation, the voice challenging the empire was not speaking from Moscow or Beijing, it was speaking from Africa itself. And while diplomats scrambled the streets of Ouagadougou filled with pride, markets buzzed with conversations about independence, taxi drivers played his speech on repeat, elderly veterans of the Sankara era saluted in tears, whispering, "He has done what we only dreamed of." Yet beneath that pride was a pulse of anxiety. Everyone knew retaliation would come, maybe not with bombs or troops, but with banks, sanctions, and headlines. But for now, the fear that had ruled for generations was gone. Burkina Faso had stared into the eyes of the empire and did not blink. And somewhere between that act of defiance and the echo of applause, a question began to spread across the continent. If one small nation could stand up and say no, what might happen when 10 do? When the last CIA convoy left Ouagadougou's dusty airfield, silence hung over the city, heavy, uncertain, and proud. For the first time in decades, no foreign intelligence flag fluttered over Burkina Faso's capital. The quiet wasn't just absence, it was ownership. But ownership comes with a price. Within days, the ripple effects began. International headlines called it reckless isolationism. Aid agencies announced reviews of their programs. Western analysts warned of economic instability. The IMF quietly postponed meetings with Burkina Faso's finance ministry. The message was clear: punishment had begun. Washington didn't need to send soldiers, it could send signals, financial ones. The U.S. dollar. Once the bloodstream of the Sahel's aid ecosystem suddenly became harder to access. Transfers slowed. Sanctions were whispered about. Insurance firms raised risk ratings. It was a familiar playbook, the same one used against nations that dared to think differently. Nasser when he nationalized the Suez Canal. Sankara when he rejected foreign loans. Mugabe when he reclaimed his land. But this time the story was different. Traore had a shield, the alliance of Sahel states, a union forged with Mali and Niger, three nations all led by soldiers, all weary of Western lectures. Together they began building something unheard of, a model of collective sovereignty. While Western commentators predicted collapse, the opposite started to happen. AS ministers met in Bamako to discuss emergency trade routes, shared food reserves, and new gold-backed financial mechanisms. In Ouagadougou, citizens gathered for cleanup campaigns, building projects, and new training centers. It wasn't wealth that spread, it was willpower. Still, the stakes were immense. By confronting Washington, Traore risked not only sanctions, but also the narrative war, the slow suffocation of a country through perception. Global outlets painted Burkina Faso as unstable, authoritarian, even paranoid. But for ordinary Burkinabe, something had changed deep within, a long-lost sense of dignity. Farmers who once relied on imported grain began organizing cooperatives. Students who used to study under Western scholarships started applying for AES fellowships. Engineers discussed building local cybersecurity programs to replace foreign software. It was a national awakening, raw and fragile, the kind that only comes when people realize that freedom and comfort rarely live in the same house. Traore himself seemed unmoved by the storm gathering abroad. In one of his speeches, he said quietly, "They can cut their funds, but they cannot cut our courage. We have survived worse drought, war, betrayal. We will survive this too." And somehow those words reached beyond borders. Across Africa, communities began asking what Burkina Faso had just proven, that true sovereignty begins not with borders, but with the control of one's own information and destiny. The young captain had done what few dared. He replaced fear with example. Burkina Faso might be poorer in dollars, but it was richer in pride. And as one elder in Bobo Dioulasso told a reporter looking at a crowd waving the national flag under the hot Sahel sun, "They took our gold, our land, our voice. Now at least we have our spine." In Washington, the shock slowly turned to strategy. Burkina Faso's defiance wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a warning shot. If one nation could expel the CIA, others might follow. Inside think tanks and policy circles, analysts whispered about the Burkina effect. The State Department began reaching out quietly to Niger and Ghana, urging them not to repeat Ouagadougou's mistake. But the truth was already spreading faster than policy could contain it. Africa was watching. And more importantly, the world was listening. For decades, Western influence in Africa depended not only on aid or military power, but on the story that stability required supervision, that African nations couldn't govern or secure themselves without foreign eyes watching over them. Traore's 48-hour ultimatum shattered that story. It forced the world to confront a question the West never liked to ask: what if Africa doesn't need us anymore? In American media, the response was divided. Some networks called it an act of geopolitical suicide. Others, particularly among independent journalists, described it as the most courageous act of the decade. Former diplomats expressed concern that the U.S. was losing Africa to what they called multipolar opportunism, a polite phrase meaning Russia and China. And indeed, Moscow and Beijing were watching closely. Russian outlets framed Traore as the African lion who roared at the empire. Chinese commentators praised Burkina Faso's courage to choose autonomy. Even Turkey's state media highlighted his move as part of a global rebalancing of power. In Paris, the mood was one of disbelief. France, long accustomed to dictating terms in its former colonies, suddenly found itself sidelined not only by African militaries, but by African public opinion. The same people who once cheered French aid were now chanting in the streets for independence from Western oversight. Meanwhile, in the United Nations corridors, diplomats from smaller nations began quoting Traore's words about protection that comes with chains. The sentiment resonated from Latin America to Southeast Asia, places that had lived the same story in different tongues. The American establishment, for its part, tried to shift the narrative. Opinion pieces appeared warning that African populism could destabilize the region. Washington offered new humanitarian packages hoping to rebuild bridges. But beneath the polite language, the unease was palpable. Something fundamental had changed the balance of fear. For the first time in decades, it wasn't the African leader who feared being cut off. It was the Western diplomat who feared being shut out. And perhaps that is the quiet revolution Ibrahim Traoré began, one that no satellite or spy network could detect: the revolution of perception. Burkina Faso may not have missiles or markets large enough to move the global economy, but it now possesses something the West once monopolized: moral authority. As one retired American general put it in a CNN interview, shaking his head in disbelief, "It's not just about Burkina Faso anymore. It's about the world realizing that the smallest nations can now say no and mean it." The dust has settled over Ouagadougou's airfield, but the echoes have not. 48 hours, that's all it took for a young African soldier to expose an empire's quiet hand. But in those 2 days, the world witnessed something rare: the return of courage to a continent too long told to wait, to obey, to depend. Captain Ibrahim Traoré didn't just expel a foreign agency, he expelled a mindset. The idea that sovereignty is negotiable, that freedom can coexist with surveillance, that Africa's independence can be outsourced. Yet the hardest days may still lie ahead. Burkina Faso's defiance has made it a symbol, and symbols are dangerous things. Economic isolation, disinformation, even covert destabilization, these are the weapons of a world order unwilling to lose its grip. And history teaches us that when small nations challenge the invisible powers, retaliation often comes cloaked in diplomacy and headlines, not in armies. Still, across the Sahel, the mood is shifting. The alliance of Sahel states Burkina Faso, Mali, Niger stands tighter than ever, bound not just by geography, but by conviction. They know what's coming, and yet they move forward. Because as Traoré himself said, they can cut their funds, but not our courage. For older generations in America, watching this story unfold, it might feel familiar. The echoes of your own revolutions, your own fights for independence, your own defiance against distant kings and unseen empires. The faces may be different, but the struggle is the same. Who controls your destiny, you or someone who claims to protect you? Burkina Faso has chosen its answer. And the question now extends far beyond Africa. If one small nation can reclaim its right to see, speak, and think for itself, what excuse do the others have for remaining silent? The age of quiet supervision is cracking, and in its place rises something far more unpredictable: the age of awakened nations. So we ask you, do you think President Ibrahim Traoré's defiance marks the true beginning of Africa's freedom from invisible control? Or is it just the calm before a greater storm? Let us know in the comments below. Please share this video if you believe that truth deserves a voice louder than fear. And subscribe if you believe that Africa's story, the story of dignity, courage, and sovereignty, deserves to be told again and again until the whole world listens.